All right, today I'm talking here with Ken Shepard, who's led the Global Organization Design Society for about 14 years now, is that right? And he's a management consultant, many years of experience in the field. So can you give us a bit of a background about how you got into consulting?
Let's see where to start. In '81, I finished a doctorate. It was a mid-career doctorate at UCLA in management, and I moved to Canada to be at the Niagara Institute. Mm-hmm. And there I was director of the Management of Change and Public Affairs programs. So I was exposed to a network of corporations who were really at leading edge in Canada. And part of that job was to begin certain consultations, bringing government, business, and labor groups together. Mm-hmm. And then that developed into a series of projects, which was the beginning of my management consulting. So it was during the 1980s at the Niagara Institute. Mm-hmm. And I would say it really developed when one of the provinces, New Brunswick, really took an interest in our methods. And I was consulting there for 3 or 4 years with the head deputy minister and deputy ministers of many of the departments, and began to use some requisite ideas toward the end of that. But that's how I got into management consulting. Mm-hmm. But my background was in org behavior, and I had previously been a city planner, so I had some planning technology and frameworks, mental maps. And then I had always been interested in behavior. I'd been trained at national training laboratories and all kinds of group work, and then at UCLA. And I had been through a lot of therapy and a lot of personal development. I was soaking in hot tubs at Esalen and kind of awareness building, and so I knew that to be a consultant I had to be aware of myself, but those are the early days of consulting.
So when did you first come across Requisite?
Well, it wasn't called Requisite. I was doing my doctorate at UCLA, and was one of the professors that asked me to teach a course while I was on vacation, parts of a course, and that was at the University of Southern California. And I was walking through, and this fellow was giving a lecture, and it was their 50th anniversary of the School of Public Administration. And I didn't know this guy was Elliott Jaques, and he had his slides, and I stopped and I listened, and all of a sudden I said, this guy has the answer. I've been struggling through the doctorate program, many theories, and Elliott says it's really about time. It's the time dimension that's important. And I had remembered one of the theories in school was Rensis Likert. Mm-hmm. And I read his book several times, who was in the early, I guess he was writing in the late 60s and 70s about leadership and organizations. But when it came to the management of change, he had one line in his whole book. Mm-hmm. He says, I think it's about time, but we don't know much about that. So reading that, and then here Elliott said, this is about time. Uh-huh. And I said, yes, and time horizon, that fit with my planning. And it also fit with some of the mental maps, because I knew the people I was working with had different maps of the world. And and he had a framework for that, so I was delighted. That was 1978. So it didn't, then it next came up, I was head of a professional association called Accord in Toronto, and there had been two. One had been the Association for Creative Change, more religious change agents, and the other one was the Canadian Association for Applied Social Science. And we had merged the two into a group, and it was a small group that was about, 35, then it grew to about 100. And it was about that time we were expanding our professional development. We sat in a circle. Who would you most like to study with? And each of us went around and we said, well, invite them. So some of my friends had been out to California to study with Elliott Jaques, and I had a consulting assignment, I couldn't go. So I said, I'm going to study with Elliott Jaques, because I couldn't go, and they were very excited about it.
Yeah.
And so I called him up and said, we'd like to run a workshop. Would you like to do a workshop for us? And he came up and we did a one-day workshop. And then it went so well that we talked, and he said, this is a good group. I think we should have a 7-day workshop. And that started, I think, around 1991. We did 3 or 4 7-day workshops, then we did 3-day workshops, we did large 1-day workshops with as many as 300 in the room, big hotel plenaries, and all the big banks each had a table of 8. We had all the banks there. And these were big days.
Yeah.
And so I had been head of the organization, and so I sponsored and produced these things with Elliott Jaques from about 1991 to 1998. So that's kind of how I learned about it. And I first moderated the first 7 days, then the next one I sat and learned, and then I sat through about 4 or 5 of those. So I'm a slow learner, and I'm slowly getting it. And I started putting these things, these concepts in my practice one by one. It took me 8 or 9, 10 years to really put it all together. And it was done very deliberately and slowly.
Yeah. What would you say was one of those things that at first you didn't quite appreciate about it or understand about it that really you found most useful now that you're more familiar with it?
I don't remember anything I didn't understand about it. Now there probably were things, but I repressed those.
Yeah.
But I can tell you the one thing that that attracted me to it. It's kind of an aha. I had gone through the doctorate. Took about 7 years, and including about 3 years on the dissertation. And this field of organization development, I thought it was like a marshmallow, like clouds, like there was no foundation. It was just, it seemed like everything was participation, and the more participation, the better. And there were all these pieces of theories. And so I did a Delphi study of 70 experts, and I said, where is this field going? That was basically, it was a very elaborate, it took me a year and a half to do, and I was looking for, how do you put all these different ideas together? And I'll tell you, when I listened to Elliott Jaques that first session, I said, he has an integrated framework. I actually can figure out where each of these pieces of theories, everybody invented these pieces, how they could be fit together. And some of them were nonsense and shouldn't be there at all. Others could be done much better using a requisite framework. I mean, the doctoral program, there had been a famous article, one of the bestsellers of all times, called by Howdy Kuntz, Harvard Business Review, The Management Theory Jungle. And then there had been a Management Theory Jungle Revisited. And what it said is, management theory is a soup of nothing. And so this theory really put it all together, and I had a framework that had levels of organization. No other theory had ever talked explicitly about levels. And then accountability was a major concept. I mean, there had been management by objectives, but the thing had never been able to work. And because they were all on 1-year time horizons. Many of the objectives should be on 3 and 5 and 10 year. And they didn't have those insights. So when you put Elliott's theory together with management objectives, it would have been implemented entirely differently. So anyway, I would say the aha is, this is a broad system of interlocking pieces that gives me a way to see the field. And now when I talk about participative methods or asking questions of people, I now ask questions at the proper level, questions that people can answer. We used to ask questions, we used to ask people at level 1, what should our mission be? Not an appropriate question for a level 1 person. Okay, so you learn to ask the questions that are appropriate to the level. So anyway, does that give you a sense?
Yeah, that's a really good background. Where I'd want to go with this next is, I know there's a lot of people, especially in my age group, but that are still unfamiliar with management in general as a concept, and especially with requisite ideas. And so I think Elliott said something like it would take 100 years for these ideas to become, accepted and understood. So can you give me how are we doing on that track? Can you give me some examples of companies that have been using it or places it's been implemented?
Well, one way I like to frame it is compared to what else? What other theory? How are we doing compared to other theories? And I'm trying to think of another total integrated theory to compare with.
Good point.
I can't think of any. This is a pretty radical integrated theory. Other theories are quite partial.
Yeah.
Then a friend of mine, Jerry Gray, who was dean of the business school at the University of Manitoba, he says, think of all the management frameworks and techniques. None of them are actually taught in the university. Quality was never taught. Deming stuff was very important, never taught there. He says the management textbooks are kind of a buffet of short introductions to 100 different concepts,
Yep.
not put together in any integrated way.
That's my experience.
That's your experience as well. Yeah, and they're all fractional. And let me go back. You're in school now, going through, you may do a graduate degree.
Mm-hmm.
Generally, graduate degrees, well, even undergraduate, engineering, architecture, business, generally they don't teach anything about the career progression in your field.
Mm-hmm.
They don't teach anything about management. I'll just take for an example, I got a master's in city planning. So there was a lot about teamwork. How do you get along in teams to produce a solution to this problem? Well, that's very good. We learned to fight with each other. We learned how to pretend not to. We weren't fighting with each other. But they did not really even teach us any skills in how to get along. They just put us in teams and we fought it out. And very unhappily, in many ways, in many cases. But one example that I think really works well is one of our colleagues in Argentina was president of Whirlpool Argentina, and then he, as an engineer, he was hired on the faculty to teach in an undergraduate engineering school. And I believe they also now have a master's. And somehow he learned the Elliott Jaques methods, and somehow he convinced the school to put in a career or management course. So in every undergraduate engineering student has a semester with Ricardo Gutierrez, who's a wonderful professor. And he teaches them not only Elliott's structure, but something about their career and its progression.
Mm-hmm.
So we now have this e-learning, which is you can collapse down to maybe 5 or 6 hours with some reading, maybe 10 or 15 hours. My sense of what would really be great is that every professional school, like for doctors, lawyers, architects, engineers, that there be at least 10 or 20 hours, maybe exposure to e-learning about how organizations work and then how careers work in their progression. What's a doctor's career path look like as they move up management in a hospital or in some kind of a public health network? And how do they, because they have none of that.
It gives you the awareness of stuff to expect, and generally my experience is when you give people this information, it's a big aha and a motivator.
Big.
And it also says something like, so you point out they might have potential in a couple of years to be doing something they didn't think they could. It says, well, wow, I really need to get myself ready for that.
Exactly. I can see student assignments where they need to go interview people at different levels in a career. Maybe they do it in a group, but it wouldn't be hard to get interviews with somebody who's a recent graduate engineer working at a desk, individual contributor. Then you get an interview with that person's manager about their job, and then you somehow do a group interview, and maybe at the highest levels you have to record them on video, and you don't get access to the CEO who was an engineer and got there, but at least they get to hear what they're dealing with and how it sounds differently. They get a sense of the career, and then they get a sense of the lateral relationships, and they get a sense of the practices. I wasn't taught any of that, so when I went in, my first job in city planning was a big transportation study. We were doing computer simulation of transportation and urban growth. We had 100 people. Probably no more than 10 of those people were working effectively. Why? There were a lot of engineers, there were operations researchers. I don't think a single person in that organization had ever, this was in the 60s now, early 60s, has ever been trained in management at all. Nothing. Very painful. So then I went through a period of some other jobs. I don't think I ever worked for anyone who had had any training in organization management or design. Many painful experiences. And yet they sent us off to places like national training laboratories to learn how to get along in groups. Well, what you do in those trainings is you wake up and you realize you don't want to be in these terrible organizations anymore. These paranoia-inducing organizations that Elliott Jaques talked about.
Yeah.
They're poorly designed, poorly managed. So when people use the word hierarchy, what they basically mean is an organization designed by nobody, with no theory, staffed inappropriately, and it's basically, it's just stress-inducing, and it makes people crazy. And it's really painful. It's a miracle that anything gets done.
Yeah, well, I have a couple ideas sort of about, because I'm coming from that generation where the general connotation around hierarchies is quite negative. And I think that there's a couple of things I'd run by you on that. One is that there's a difference between a dominance hierarchy and a competence hierarchy.
Exactly.
And so, yes, some organizations are playing power games and whatever, and those things aren't very good, but when you have something from RO gives you a framework to objectively get people in the right roles so that it not only get themselves in the right roles, but everyone else, so that you're getting the context you need to do your work, you're in a position where you're at the right level of challenge, and it works better for everyone, and that's based on the competence of the person, so it's not based on arbitrary power. And I think that there's a big distinction, because like most people will say, when they say hierarchy, they mean dominance hierarchy.
Or status, or, I mean, when Elliott was studying levels of organization in the UK, I think he came up with 33 levels in the British Navy. Or, I think he did some work for Nortel here in Canada.
Yeah.
And I think they had 18 levels. Now, they sent a bunch of their VPs down to study with Elliott, and they got it down to 12 and 11 and 9.
Yeah, getting closer.
Getting closer. But the hierarchy that is well designed over levels of complexity and people is very different from, the reason they had 32 or the reason they had 18 is because if you want to promote someone, you've got to give them a couple of subordinates.
Yeah.
And then you want to promote the subordinates. You've got to give them a couple of subordinates. You start building layers based on a Hayes system. I don't know what, some kind of personnel considerations. And it may not be only power, but it's basically just so you can promote and pay people a little more.
Yeah.
As these things grow over the years, and they're very dysfunctional.
Well, and so if you understand the levels of work and human complexity and capability, you can reward performance or change pay without messing up the whole hierarchy system.
Exactly.
Yeah.
There you go.
And so, just for viewers who wouldn't be quite familiar, what is, like, how many, we're talking about most organizations, so if you had about a general business, would be about 5 levels. And then if you had, like, a corporate business, you're looking maybe 6.
So let's say a guy he's a handyman in the neighborhood. He works out of his garage.
Yeah.
It's a level 1 organization. Okay, there's a mom and pop store at the corner. They have an employee. It's a level 2 organization. Then there's a local bookstore. And they actually have 2 layers of management. There's the store, maybe the owner or the person who runs the store. Then there's a level of managers, and then there's staff under that. It's a level 3 organization. Okay, 4, you get up to a plant level, perhaps manufacturing plant. Now there are full businesses at 4. There's a single plant, there's this. The 5-unit business, the 5-level business unit was first, in fairly large corporations, that was named by McKinsey. In fact, a guy by the name of Rod Carnegie, who was a big star leader in Requisite Organization, he worked with GE, and he's the one who first formalized the 5-level business unit as the place where you can really run and do the books on a profit basis. And so that's kind of an ideal form for a fairly large business unit. Although there are business units at all of those other levels.
Yeah, well,
the handyman's got a business unit.
There's examples of a professional whose business, for example, if you had a couple of lawyers, their business may only be a level 3 business, but then they're working at whatever level in their casework and all that type of stuff. But if you see an organization that has anywhere above 8, you're probably, in most cases, you're in
Well,
a couple extra layers there.
Yes, 7 supposedly can handle a global corporation. They say 8 in the U.S. Army during wartime, maybe. Many organizations have 8, 9, 10. So there's some compromises and there's a little dysfunction. But with this theory, you can predict where the dysfunction is and how to mitigate it.
Yeah.
But it's not ideal.
And use it if you need to,
Use it.
strategically. Yeah. So the other idea about hierarchy, where I think this is my grandfather Don's idea actually. So he did some work looking at the Flynn effect, which is how IQ increases about 3% a decade. And if that's
In the population at large.
in the population at large, yes. But he's saying
I would
that-
like to think that my IQ went
yeah.
3 points per decade, and that means you've still got some to go.
Yeah, well, so he was doing some modeling looking at the stratum and mode of populations based on that projection. And what seems to be increasingly happening is that the really bright guys coming out of school are at 3, but they're put in a level 2 job. And then they think they blame the hierarchy as opposed to being misplaced.
That's right.
And, they don't feel respected, the work's too easy, and your boss isn't adding context, and it's just not a conducive place to good work. So I think there's a bit of that, and then those are the smart people who coming out of school at 3 are going to be leading organizations, and they move away from hierarchy when that wasn't really the issue.
High moon people are often misplaced.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So another idea, I was talking to Don earlier this week about some of this hierarchy stuff, and he'd said what he really liked about Elliott was that it seemed to him that at the time in the history of sort of organizational studies that there was a lot of emphasis on the idea of consensus and of sort of having a voice as the rest of the people in the organization, and that people were trying to do all this consensus stuff. And it was a marriage between keeping that voice with stuff like you need to give your manager the best advice and they need to seek that from you, but making it a hierarchy of accountability and authority to make decisions that allowed the simplicity, so stuff actually got done while trying to keep some of that voice and making sure that the communication was working. And so I really like that sort of take on it.
Yeah, if I understand you correctly, there was a pretense with the McGregor theory wise that there had to be these large discussions, almost there had to be consensus, which really got in the way because decisions had to be made, managers were accountable. So,
and at the right level.
At the right level. So McGregor was saying theory X is where managers tell you what to do and they're bullies and it's one-way communication.
Mm-hmm.
And Elliott really talked about two-way communication.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't mean I'm not a manager and you're not a subordinate, but it means that we need to have an open channel, and it's not always possible in every culture. I mean, you may be in an Indian culture or a Chinese culture where there's fear and deference to authority figures, mm-hmm. and an employee would never tell the boss what he thinks mm-hmm. or she thinks, because it's too dangerous, because that's not what they do in that culture.
Yeah.
Or some friends that worked in Russia, and they said, look, Requisite depends on open, trusting communication. In Russia, there's very little trust.
Yeah.
So it's very hard to, how do you put in Requisite, which depends on open, trusting communication, even between a manager and a subordinate and between the team? How do you design that when there's really low trust and fear?
Yeah.
So, I think that's what we're working with today, and I think the new problems with people working at distance, online, is you don't even have face-to-face now. We're mm-hmm. dealing with email, sometimes we have these video meetings, and we're trying to pick up cues and do that, but how do managers behave? And in these new networked, sometimes working on 10 teams at once, that's the new puzzle, and Requisite has to evolve to kind of work with that.
Yeah. So I want to back up a little bit for people who are less familiar with the whole idea of management. How would you describe that to somebody? What is management, and why is that important?
Starting fairly basically.
Yeah.
Management. Why is it important? Well, someone owns or controls a business, let's
Yeah.
just say that I have some capital and I want to set up a coffee shop. I need help. I need to make some decisions. I don't hire several people and we sit down necessarily and talk about everything. I need to get the store built. I need to design. So I've got to design the roles, contract people, then I have to hire staff, I have to train them, and I have to make sure that things are done. I have to schedule them. Now you can say, well, why can't people schedule themselves? I mean, there are some people who try to do that. If you have guidelines for the scheduling and you say, here are the requirements, and if you can sort out among yourself who's going to be here and you commit to that, that's okay with me, but at least I've set up the guidelines to make sure this store is open at the hours it needs to be open. Now, on the other hand, if the employees buy me out, and now maybe we have several stores and we have 100 employees. 100 employees can't be the boss, so now we need some representation onto a board, so the employees elect a board. And it's now employee owned. So, well, the board, how many are on the board? 8? Can you have 8 managing directors of the board? Well, they generally appoint an executive committee and an executive chairman. Or they hire someone to be the CEO. No matter what you do, when it gets complicated, more people, you need someone to make decisions and to convene and have the right discussions and to prioritize and to allocate resources, allocate time, allocate money. So,
Well, my general experience is sort of, at least from at business school, is okay, you're going to go run a business or you're going to be a part of a business, and management is just, well, you're managing it. That's it. But there's no, there's no theory behind it. There's no principles or advice on how to do it successfully and how to take, for example, take a strategy and make sure that the things you're doing management-wise make that strategy into a concrete, actually happening on the ground stuff. So it's always tough. I just want to go back as well to, could you give us, either from your experience or somebody you know knows experience of the power of getting the management right? And so maybe going through an example of a company that's been consulted with or that's adopted some of these principles and the before and after, what their experience was.
So there are a number of major companies around the world who have used all or part of the system with amazing results. So a smaller company that used it for over 20 years, Novus International down in St. Louis, spin-off of Monsanto. They've worked with almost the same consultant. They've gone through 3 CEOs. And I had the opportunity to go in and interview people from the CEO down to the receptionist. And we've gotten case studies written up. There's a book about it. We've got videos. We've really documented that case on what it means. And we asked people in the video interviews, how is this different from other companies you've worked in? And so you can hear their excitement and enthusiasm. And they've had good performance over the years. So that's a kind of that was a company of 500 that's grown up to about 1,000, high tech, a lot of PhDs working there. But there are some other major corporations that over the years have used it. One is probably one of the largest in the world is Unilever. And they worked with David Billis, who had been one of Elliott Jaques' proteges at Brunel, and Brian Dive. And there's a book, I think it's called The Healthy Organization, about the Unilever experience. And that had many spin-offs. They worked a lot on getting the levels right, executives, getting the talent pool going. And actually one of the representatives of Unilever in India actually left and went with Tata, which is one of the largest, really a huge corporation in the world. Tata does everything. And he took Requisite Organization and what he learned in Unilever into Tata. And they used it for their management system for all of their many companies, not only in India but around the world. And so Requisite, that's going cross-cultural a bit.
Yeah.
So then a major oil company whose name will come to me in a second. The Royal Dutch Shell. And one of the largest companies in the world had operations there. I mean, they must have had operations in 120 countries. And the way they were organized, each country was like a separate company. And they had their own financial reporting. And it took them about 9 months to roll up a financial statement. Because, so John Hofmeister had worked at GE when Jack Welch was there. He'd gone with a couple of spin-offs whose names are slipping right now, but eventually he went in, I think it's a level 5 and then a level 6 executive VP at Royal Dutch Shell. And he spent 10 years reorganizing into one company. And they used the levels to level the country companies that they had. Now, before, all the CEOs of each country were at the same level. But that doesn't make sense, because in Bolivia, all it was a level 3 distribution unit. You know, and then in Brazil, it was a level 5 company. And in the United States, it was a level 6 company. So now you had a way of leveling the jobs. Now that doesn't mean the CEO in each country didn't have a limousine to drive to see the president of the company. So you have to have some status symbols, but their salary and everything else was done using requisite levels. Well, it took them about 10 years, from 1995 to 2005 to do that. But that's a remarkable example. Now right here in Canada, if you think of the companies that have used this, I mean, early on, the first company to really bring it here, I mean, there were, I think, Sunoco, and back in the early 70s, they brought Elliott to speak, but in the mid and late 70s, Elliott was advising Imperial Oil on their structure. And then George Harding was head of OD there. He had a group of about 22 organizational development people. They had hired one of the guys, Eric Lucking, from Glacier to come over, and then they brought Elliott in to consult on their structure. Now George Harding's the one that introduced it to many of us in Toronto. So that's just the way the thing. So but Imperial Oil used it for, and then it spun off to some of the other oil companies. Then some of the banks used it. It was used in the Visa unit. CIBC used it extensively. Parts of RBC used it. Then other companies in Canada, big ones, Inco, used it for years before they were bought by the Brazilian company. Even Chapters Indigo organized their stores using it. My hunch is there are probably 150 Canadian companies, many of them you'd recognize.
Yeah, I think Canadian Tire was one.
Oh, Canadian Tire was an early one. Canadian Tire Acceptance, absolutely.
Yeah.
There were many, many Canadian companies. On our website, I think we have over 300 companies worldwide.
This is the Go Society.
Go Society's website, yeah. And then we have a census of senior practitioners around the world. There must be approaching 400 to 500 of those now. Senior people use this method. So. But if that gives you a sense of scale and accomplishment and how seriously it's taken.
Yeah. Well,
and I might mention the U.S. Army. They started using it in 1981, and almost all branches of the uniformed and non-uniformed have been through aspects of Requisite. It's been used by, and some of the methods were developed with the general staff of the U.S. Army. So very impressive work. There's on our website the documentation of use probably over almost 20 years.
Yeah. So this gives me a sense of, from as RO, when you're looking at it as a total integrated system and from an organizational design perspective. Now, if I were an individual and I'm in a company and I'm in a new I'm in a management position, and I'm trying to figure out how can I use some of these ideas without having the control to change all the company to really be a better manager myself and maybe affect things in the team around me. What would be some ideas or principles or takeaways that might be useful?
One of the first things I do is come to the Go Society site and take the e-learning and read some of the basic reading. So to do the e-learning, it's very inexpensive. 5 hours of that, read some articles, watch some other videos, maybe 10, 15 hours, you would have a very good overview. It's a very good, then you can explore. Now, as a manager, without a lot of power, the things I would start with is the management practices. So I had one of my clients in Canada was the Victorian Order of Nurses, which had thousands of visiting nurses across Canada, and they had regional offices and so forth. So I had encouraged them to send some of their regional managers to one of our trainings and our conferences. And I interviewed him afterwards, after he'd gone through a 3-day training in the conference. And he said, you know what I learned? He said, I went to the pre-conference workshop on management practices. He said, there was a concept called setting context. He said, I realized I didn't have a ghost of an idea. He said, without context, and then I learned how to delegate, give context, and then delegate. And delegate effectively. I had no idea what it was to assign a task. And he said, it's a lot more work. He says, but now, when I give context and assign a task with context, the probability of it actually getting done on time within resources goes
way up.
Way up. He said, just that, learning to really learn how to delegate, to design the task and give context and really give it well, improved my performance remarkably. So I would say learn the practices and study them one by one. You do not have to change the organization to do that.
I think that's a perfect place to start, I think. And from my experience, from the work that I've done when I've been in a managerial position, I found that it's a lot of work, but it's making sure that you're communicating properly and making sure that you've assigned the task properly is like the key to getting this stuff done. I mean, it's
Exactly. The other thing to do is probably on our website. I don't know if the camera can see this. We published this book, and it's for sale on Amazon, but you can get it free on our website. And I would just read sections of it that are interesting to you.
And that's organization design, levels of work and human capability. And I know there's, if I'm correct, there's a lot of people who contributed to this.
There are 30-some people from around the world. The idea, when Elliott died, he had not really written up any of his cases because he believed in client confidentiality. And he said, we need a book about implementation. So we got in touch and recruited 32 of our best people, and they each wrote chapters of some different aspect of their implementation. So this is really a
good resource.
It's a very good resource.
So one of the other things that struck me when I was looking at Requisite was the idea of trying to get a common language to speak about things, to speak about management. So this goes back to the idea that management's a big soup of nothing, and you go into an organization and there's no common definition of anything. And so a lot of what I see from Elliott is there's sort of an emphasis on making sure that you're able to communicate because you have the same language. So can you talk about a bit how RO tries to make a bit of a common language for people to use?
He insisted on what he called univocal definitions. It means this. And so here is what a manager is. So there is no definition of manager in the literature. It just doesn't. People will give you many different. So do you have to use the requisite organization vocabulary? Well, the trick is you ask the company to name their own management system. So here in Toronto, a big pharmaceutical company called Hoffman Roche Pharmaceuticals, they had the Roche management system. That was all based on Requisite. The definitions were Requisite, but they say this is how we talk about management at Roche, and this is the Roche management system. And they trained and gave a lot of reinforcement and made sure the definitions were used. They did the same thing. There is the Novus management system for Novus International. Right? So we encourage people to have their own, and if they want to change the definition of a word, change it, but have it in the glossary so that people know what it means and they use it that way.
Well,
that cleans everything up.
You can prepare it, a nice little glossary for new people. Give them a good thing for onboarding. I mean, part of my experience, I worked as an internship at a pharmaceutical company, and you know, I got in there. By the time the internship was done, I was just learning what they were talking about. I mean, it's you want to help bring people into the culture, into the organization, and stuff like that. I mean, it makes it easier.
I mentioned Novus International, who'd used this method for about 20 years. Well, they were developing offices in different countries around the world, and it was very expensive to train people. And when new people came in, there may be 2 or 3 new people here or 2. You can't let them travel to home office to be trained. It's very expensive. That's when they developed this e-learning modules, 5 or 6 hours. So everyone who joins the firm takes the e-learning, even the receptionist.
Yep.
Then they have group discussions. And now, of course, they can talk and have workshops on the web, and they can have discussion groups, but everyone who joins the company learns the management system. And they have not only Requisite or the Novus management system, but they have a series of maybe 8 or 10 other videos that are all part of the orientation process that they have to go through and discuss. So that's the way you onboard people.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah.
So another thing, and this came up sometime we were having lunch a while ago, but you talked about one of the books that really ideas that had taken you in the past while was the Exponential Organization. Do you want to give a brief sort of overview about what took you about that book?
Well, when I was in school in the 50s and 60s, basically. And this was, every line went up to the right. It was linear.
Yeah.
And we did all kinds of projections with Penn Jersey Transportation Study. We had regression analysis and we would do our projections. Well, when digitization came in, now we started having exponential growth. Today as a society, we do not understand exponential growth. So the question that they stump people on, you know, if a lily's in a pond, double every day, and lily pads cover the pond in 45 days, on what day was the pond half covered?
Day before.
Exactly. That's what exponential, that's what we don't get.
Yeah.
We don't get these trigger points, and that's why many of the forces we deal with, especially in computers, and everything is now possible. And people don't realize how fast the change will come. Now, a Requisite Organization was developed in an era of linear growth. And Elliott was writing his book with a fountain pen. Okay? So, you know, he died in his late 80s, around 2000. So basically Skype, when we started this organization, the Go Society, we could do it globally because Skype was founded in 2003, the year Elliott died. And if you look at what's happened to our computers and our internet connections and our speed and our memory, it's all been from about 2003, 2007, everything took off.
Yep.
Everything was founded around 2007. And so it's a whole new world, and we network and work, and the speed is amazing. Now people say, what effect does this have on time horizons?
Yep.
And we don't know yet. Some people say that, yes, we work faster and more intensely, but you still have to see broad patterns, and there are still 20-year timelines.
Yep.
And if we don't look at them, we're in bad shape.
Well, I have sort of 2 thoughts about that. Is one of them is that you still have to look at the amount of time that you're sort of having intentionality over. Like, there's still, time horizon still is a really useful thing to look at. But on the other hand, like, I've run across people whose jobs are really complex and they're only 2-week projects. And I don't know quite how to deal with that, you know, like, it just starts to muddy the waters a bit.
Yeah. So Josh, you asked me about complexity at lower levels, having complex tasks but at lower levels. And so a colleague, Herb Goplowitz, helped me think about this. He said that many consulting firms use very bright young consultants who might be capable at level 3 or at level 4.
Yeah.
that almost all their consulting projects can be weeks or months.
Yep.
And they're one after another.
Yep.
Now, what his sense was that we all need to be able to stretch and use ourselves, and that if we're, let's say we're level 4 capable, but we're always working on things no longer than maybe a year.
Yep.
That actually we're compressed, stressed, and burning out. We can only do that for a period of time. We need time out. Well, that's exactly how the consulting firms work. They'll hire young people, they'll burn them for 3 or 4 or 5 years, and let them go work for somebody else. It's not sustainable. And they'll take some who become partners. Now, the partners do not work on those short projects so much. They're into really client development, building the business, expanding into new markets. They have these longer tasks. And they say that in a consulting firm, Don told me, one of the longest tasks is managing your own career, because these tasks are too short. So when you say, let's just take high-tech companies and the way they're organizing, they often organize with high-mode people on contract for short periods. And they hire them and get rid of them. They hire them and get rid of them. They're literally burning them. People find it very, very hard to work at that level of intensity.
Yep.
And so everyone craves this ability to work at their natural, with space, so they can juggle and work.
It's the right level of challenge for them.
The right level of challenge for them. And of course, during wartime, some of the examples Elliott gave, 5-star generals during World War II, there's enormous complexity at very high speed. And they do it for relatively short periods of time. And you need that extra capability to be able to handle that complexity very short, because in battle, the complexity and the changes, everything is unpredictable. Things are happening very, very fast. There's tremendous complexity, but it's just not sustainable.
Yeah.
Now, in this new world of tech, so we're getting into product development, and it may be good to look at some of these high-tech companies and how they're organizing. But my hunch is that there are strategists, and then a lot of individual contributors who move around and work on different things. But most of the pace they're working at is probably not sustainable pace.
That resonates with me a lot.
Okay.
Yeah.
What do you?
Well, it was a couple of days ago I was sort of thinking about it, and I've always been big about always making sure that I'm working out and making sure that I have time on my relationships, even when I'm working a lot. And my rationale for that is that I'm taking I'm looking at long-term sustainability, and if I keep those things which keep me healthy, and I mean working out also keeps my fluid intelligence from going down and stuff, that if I take the long run, even though I didn't get as much done this week, I got a lot more done over my career. And I think it's a mismatch, and there's a conflict between organizations and the individuals now, because you're not at a company for one time. So they don't care about your long-term productivity, they just want you now. And so there's to me it's that big conflict on incentives between the organization and the individual. I'd make the argument that I think there's things you can do to start fixing the turnover problem of really high turnover that makes a business case for aligning the incentives to look at more longer term productivity.
There's a firm that presented, it's a client of Jerry Crane's at Levinson & Company. It's a It's a Texas Paravitas. It's a Texas software company that's continually been rated as one of the best consulting firms to work with. They're working in technology and management consulting, and they focus on picking very high-mode people and putting a lot into their personal development and the balance. And it's one of the few companies that really we've seen doing that. And so I think there's a lot we don't understand, and that many of our companies are actually using people and throwing them away. And that we need to take some responsibility for ourselves, but if we try to protect ourselves in those environments, we may get fired.
Mhm.
Because we're not we're not showing our face for the number of hours. And
Yeah.
we're not working all night on those projects. So I don't know, in Requisite, we don't have a way of thinking about work-life balance or balance between the organization and the person. I think we need to get those thoughts from another theory.
Mhm.
In Requisite, we say, generally well organized, you can do the same work with fewer people. Some people misuse it and make the organization overly lean, and then they drive people.
Yeah.
Well, is that moral to use people up that way? So Requisite is a tool. It can be well used or poorly used. And there are some who are wanting to make things leaner and leaner and leaner.
Yeah.
And drive people harder and harder. And I don't know how as a society we start, France has had an idea, in Europe people have longer vacations. But in our society, people are driven pretty hard and have fairly short vacations.
Well, and I think there's an appetite, and at least from my perspective, coming into the workforce, of I really want to get a lot done, and I have a drive to naturally work. I'm very conscientious, and I'm creative, and I want to work and be very productive. But at the same time, I'm aware of the long-term productivity, and so I think there's an appetite for people like that who are going to be very productive for you, that are interested in companies that are able to make that balance. And I think there's a potential opportunity there for a shift in strategy about talent pool management, where you can start to get some of the bright young up-and-comers and actually, if not keep them, but get them you may not keep them their whole career. There's always going to be turnovers, but you're going to get a lot more out of them, I think, if you align yourselves with them.
So one thing Requisite talks about is felt fair pay. And the thing that's out of kilter in, I think, North America and increasingly other societies, even Japan, this making CEOs into kings, that they make such a multiplier, even of their next reports, that there's so much competition to be the next king, and then they live like royalty. And what it does, it breaks down trust. And to get those rewards and to get those high salaries, they have to milk and produce profits at the cost of short-term really destroying value in the company.
Yes.
Mark Van Cleef, one of our associates who's done a lot of work on CEO value and these compensations, shows that we're now paying our CEOs to destroy wealth. And he's got an amazing analysis to show that. And until the pension funds and the stockholders start holding the boards and the CEOs accountable and get that trust reestablished, it's very unlikely these companies are going to treat people well, because as long as the king is extracting wealth for his own or her own private gain, he's going to abuse the company, because that's the only way you extract more wealth in the short term.
Yeah. Well, two things go through my mind. One of them is at the New York conference that we were at a couple of years ago. I remember Fred Stanford giving a speech, and part of what he was talking about was I think this is from Ian MacDonald's work, if I'm not mistaken, but it's the importance of the symbols and of the artifacts of the culture. And so one of those is, you have the executives living like royalty, and they get the nice parking spot and the whatever. And I remember that one of the big changes they made at a company was that the parking spots near the door weren't for the executives, they were for the people who were in and out all day doing repairs or maintenance. And that there's things that you can do where I don't quite know how to say this. I mean, I'm not exactly against status per se, but there's things that you can do that make sure that the CEO is part of that company, and that the company feels that they're all in the same boat, as opposed to this sort of, well, they're up in the executive suite and they're the big kings somewhere else. And
So if you found a company and then grow it to a level 5, and you have good values, you can hire Ian McDonald and do your values analysis and do it very nicely. However, as you become successful and as you age, and if you don't have a son or daughter to take it over, you will go public, you will sell it. The holding company that buys it doesn't care. Oh, it's now cheaper to produce in China. We close all operations in the States, it's moved. What happens to your value system, the trust, the whatever? And what are you now doing? Or you may be hiring illegals or slave labor to produce the thing. So the more the wealth is concentrated, the more there's financial measures, and the only measure is financial, and the more it's in the stock market. What happens to all those values we intended when we founded the company? That's what's happening to many very idealistic companies, is they get sold and
Well, what I would say is that if you're a CEO who's coming into one of these companies, now it's coming from upstream in the ownership category, but if you're looking to turn around a company, or if you're looking to run a company, that getting these things right, some of the Ian McDonald stuff, some of the requisite stuff, and establishing a culture of trust will outperform cutting the costs and moving to China potentially, or will, like, in my mind, I think that it's more powerful.
We need more studies to prove that that's true.
Yeah.
But thus far, most have moved to China. Most have moved to Mexico.
Yeah.
That's so. It's hard to know where the leverage is.
Yeah. Well, I think this was a good place to stop. I want to give you a chance to say, for our viewers who are interested in learning more about this, where to go, what to do.
Well, I would suggest going to the Global Organization Design Society website, taking a look around, but then doing the e-learning is one of your first ventures, just to see it, take a taste. It's a relatively modest thing. And then read a little bit. This is not a bad place to start. And
if you're a CEO who's looking to maybe get some work done or talk to somebody about some of this stuff, well, you can call us and we'll refer you to a consultant who might fit. There's a chapter in here just for CEOs toward the end of the book. What should you do? Perfect.
I recommend it.
Well, Ken, it was a pleasure. Thanks for coming on.
You're welcome.